few weeks ago, I published a video on how to use Google Colab to speed up your final Blender renders for free. Google Colab provides free high-performance GPUs for things like training deep learning models on the cloud and other high-performance computation applications. But in this video and my previous video, I demonstrate and will demonstrate how to download and install Blender on Google Colab session and render a scene much faster than a typical desktop PC. In my previous video, I demonstrated that I could speed up my render time by at least 10 times. I received a lot of comments on the video, including a number of useful suggestions on how to simplify the whole process. I also received a number of requests on how this technique could be used in other ways. Some of the requests included how to render Blender animations using Google Colab, how to render Blender scenes that have image textures, and how to change the file name of the rendered image. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do these things, and in addition, I will render my Blender scenes using OPTIX rather than Cycles, which I used in my last video. In this video, I'm not going to give a detailed explanation of the individual coding steps and what they do. I'm also not going to compare render times between my desktop PC and Google Colab. For more information on these, please check out part 1 of this video. I'll leave a link in the description of this video. One reason in particular to watch part 1 is the instructions on how to download and install a specific version of Blender for your specific project. To make sure your Blender scene renders as expected, it's best to make sure you render with the same version of Blender as your local project. So let's get started. So the first step is just to load up the Blender file that you want to render on Google Colab. Here I've just set up a simple scene, and for the purposes of this video, I'm going to add one image texture to show how you transfer these image textures to Google Colab so it renders correctly. I've also animated the camera and some of these other objects. I'll just play the video here. You can see the camera is panning in, and I've got this sphere that's hovering here in the center. Okay, so for the first part of this video, I'm going to show you how you render out an animation in MP4 format and keep the image texture as a separate file. So for the mountain here, if I bring up the shader editor window, you can see I've applied a image texture. I'll just render it out so you can see what it looks like. I'll just expand out the window so it's a little bit bigger and zoom in. So I haven't properly unwrapped the image texture or anything like that. The purpose of this video is just to show you how to copy that image texture across. So I'm just going to open up the image texture here, and I've got my JPEG of the image texture at this location. If you press the little cog over here, you can see that it's set to relative path. So that means provided that my Blender file and the image texture are in the same directory, when I copy it to Google Colab, it should render fine. So I'm just going to go open image. Okay, so I've configured my image texture correctly. I'm sure your Blender file will have many other image textures and HDRIs. It's just the same process, making sure that the relative path is set correctly. And when you transfer it to your Google Drive, they're all set with the same relative path directories. So the next thing I want to do is just set up my render settings for Google Colab. So I've set it here to render at full HD, but just to speed up the render process on Google Colab, I'm just going to reduce the percentage down to 50% so it renders at half that resolution. So although Google Colab is very quick compared with my PC here at rendering the file, it still does take some time. So I'm going to just reduce it to 50%. So I want to render 100 frames, so I've set my start frame to be 1 and my end frame to be 100. It doesn't matter what you set your render output directory to be. I'll just leave it at the default. Now to render as an MP4, you want to change your file format to FFmpeg video. You want the container to be MP4. And you can change other settings here, so you could change it from output quality to, say, perceptually lossless. And that's all you need to do there to render out a video. Then you want to go to your render properties here. Make sure your render engine's set to Cycles or Eevee, depending on what you're doing. Set the number of samples that you want to render with. I'm just going to set 500 for this purpose. And then turn on things like motion blur if you want that in your movie. And that's pretty much all you have to do. So I'm just going to save my Blender file now that I've changed those settings. I'm going to close Blender. Now you can see the directory where I've stored my Blender file. I've also got the associated ground texture, which goes with my Blender file. Now I'm just going to upload both of these to my Google Drive. So I am going to copy the entire directory of Glass Orb into Google Drive and just let that upload. Okay, now that my Blender files and textures have been uploaded to Google Drive, we're next going to go to Google Colab, where we'll start writing out the command line scripts to render our Blender file. So if you just go to Google and type in Google Colab, click on this link here, and you want to create a new notebook. So Google Colab just requires a free Google account to access. So once it's loaded, you'll be presented with this screen here. So you can just change the name of your Jupyter notebook here to something like Blender Render. And these lines here are where you type in your code. So I'm not going to write out the individual code, I'm just going to present the individual snippets of code. If you're interested in what these individual bits of code do, please go back to my the first part of this video and you'll get a better explanation there. So this first line of code just downloads Blender version 2.91 from the official Blender website. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, you probably want to match your Blender version to the version of Blender that you're using on your local PC to make sure it renders correctly. So be sure to check out part 1 where I give an explanation of how to download a specific version of Blender onto Google Colab. So to insert the next line of code, you just go Insert Code Cell. So this next line of code just installs the Blender file that we just downloaded. I'm going to insert another cell. This next line of code connects to our Google Drive so that Google Colab can see our Google Drive and access the files, like the Blender file and the texture file. This next line of code, I'm just specifying the file name for my Blender file. So you can see it's going to be stored on my Google Drive, my drive, the Glass Orb directory, which I just uploaded to Google Drive, and I've specified the name of the Blender file, which was glassorb.blend. Now I'm going to insert one more code cell. So this last line of code, I'm going to go into a bit more detail, but this is how you render your Blender file on Google Colab. So let's go through the individual steps just to explain what each of them do. So this first bit here just runs Blender on the command line by accessing the installed version of Blender, which we did in a previous step. -B means run Blender in background, so it won't bring up the interface where you would normally do your modeling and shading, it just runs it on the command line. $file name says open up the Blender file that we specified in this previous step. No audio is just required for running Blender on the command line. -E tells Blender what render engine to use. So in this case, we've specified Cycles. -O specifies the output file name. So here I've specified / means the current directory. So it's going to be stored in the same directory as the Glass Orb Blender file. And it's going to output the file name in the form image, and the hash symbols mean the frame number. So in this case, it might be, if I was rendering frame 1, it might be image 0001. Since we're rendering an animation, we want to be able to specify the frames that we want to render. So -S is the start frame for the animation. So I'm starting at frame 1. I'm going to render just say 125 frames. So -E is the end frame. So ending at 125. And -A means to render an animation. This last step here tells Blender to look for a OPTIX based device. So we're running on NVIDIA GPUs here, so we should be able to use the OPTIX engine, but you could replace this OPTIX with CUDA, for example. But in this case, I'm just going to run with OPTIX. So The next step in rendering this Blender file on Google Colab is just to run down the side here and click these plus signs to run the individual steps. But before you do that, you want to go to the Edit menu, go to Notebook Settings. Under Hardware Accelerator, we want to choose GPU because we want to render on a GPU. And you also want to tick this box here which says Omit Code Cell Output when saving to this notebook. I had a few errors unless I clicked this. And then just press Save. And then say Reload. And you can see here it's connecting to an instance of Google Colab. And you can see we're connected here, and it's giving an indication of how much RAM we're using on this instance and how much disk space we're using. Okay, so next step, click these plus buttons to download Blender first, and this will take just a few minutes. You can see here it's giving us the percentage that it's downloaded Blender. It's saying we've got about 45 seconds left. While this is downloading, I'll just mention that there is the option that you could download Blender to your Google Drive directory, so you don't have to repeat this download at every step. But I generally find this is much easier since the time required to download Blender is small compared to the total render time. So I think this is just as easy. So now that it's downloaded, you can see it saved this Blender tar file. The next step is just to install Blender. So press the play button on the next step, and this will take just a few seconds to install Blender to our Google Colab instance. And we don't have any errors, so Blender has been installed correctly. Next step, we want to connect to our Google Drive account and mount it as /G drive. So you can see it's saying go to this URL in the browser, and it wants an authorization code which gives Google Colab the rights to connect to our Google Drive. So just click on this link, and it will ask you to choose a Google account that you want to link. So I'll just click on my Google Drive, and it's saying it wants to give access to your Google account. Just say allow, and it says please copy this code and paste it into Google Colab. So just press this little copy button, go back to your Google Colab page and paste it into this cell and press enter. And it should authorize. You can see it's mounted at G drive, so Google Colab can now see our Google Drive. I'm going to click the next step, which just sets the file name to my glass orb. If we go back to my Google Drive and go to my glass orb folder, you can see I've got the glassorb.blend file here uploaded and my rocks ground image texture. So let's just run the last step now. So you can see it's read the blend file correctly, glassorb.blend, and if you scroll down here you can see it's starting the rendering process. And this might just take a few moments for the start of the rendering of the first frame. Okay, so you see we've got some progress here. So you can see it's loaded in my rocks texture. It's using the sky texture, and it started rendering out the tiles. So you can see at the moment it's rendered 10 out of the 40 tiles on the first frame here on the left. And you can see the number of samples that it's rendered for each. So you can see so far we've had about 1 minute and 48 seconds of render time. And it's rendered about half the tiles on the first frame. Just give that a second to finish that one. Okay, so it's rendered the first frame, and let's just see how long that took. Scroll up, so it took about 2 minutes total to initialize the rendering process, and let's just see how long the next one's going to take. Each frame actually takes a lot less than that. Looks like it takes about a minute to render each frame, but you can see here on the left we're at frame 2 of 125 now. So I'm just going to leave that for a bit, and then we'll come back and we will look at the finished product. Okay, so you can see that Blender's finished rendering that video file. Because of the time that it takes to render this, I've just told it to render 2 frames, but if you continue with that last process I just showed you, it'll continue on to 125 frames or whatever number of frames that you've selected. It tells you the total time that it took to render it, and it will say Blender quit. So let's go back to our Google Drive now and see the image or the video that it's produced. You can see here it's made a file called image001 to the frame number 0125.mp4. And you can see, there we have it. The animation's been rendered on Google Colab and stored in Google Drive, which you can then download by right-clicking. I'm just going to download it to my desktop. And there you have it, the animation. Okay, now I'm going to show you a second method of doing this, and this involves embedding all the image textures into the Blender file that itself, so you don't have to upload all the individual image textures up to Google Colab. And in this example, I'm also just going to show you how to render a static, a single frame rather than an animation. So this will output a .png file. So what I'm going to do is duplicate my directory here, so glass orb directory, and I'm just going to call it glass orb 2. So let's load that up and double click on the glass orb. Alright, so nothing's changed from the previous time that I set up the Blender file. All I'm going to do this time is first go over to our output properties. I'm going to change the file format to PNG, and I think I can leave all the other settings correct. I'm just going to ramp up the resolution to 100% again so it renders a full HD image. You know, render properties, still got 500 samples. I'm going to leave it as is. But what I'm going to do now is embed all the image textures that I'm using within my Blender file into the Blender file itself. So if you go up to the File menu and go External Data and go Automatically Pack into .blend, and you can see down here in the bottom it says packed one file. So what this has done is it's saved that rocks image texture into the Blender file, so I don't actually have to upload that JPEG image anymore. It'll save all your HDRIs, it'll save your image textures into the Blender file. And then you just want to go File, Save. And if you go to File again and have a look at External Data, you can, if it can't find the files for some reason, you can say Report Missing Files or Find Missing Files and correct all that here. So now that I've done that, just make sure it's saved, close your Blender file. And to demonstrate that this works, I'm going to delete the rocks texture that's used within my Blender file. Then I'm going to go to my Google Drive, and I'm going to upload this directory. I'm going to go to my Google Drive and I'm going to upload this second directory that I've just made, the glass orb 2 directory. And just give that a minute to upload. The file size of the Blender file that I've just created will be larger because it's saving the image textures within the Blender file now. And it's just a convenient way of packaging and sharing Blender files. Okay, so now that I've uploaded that new Blender file, I'm going to go back to my Google Colab notebook here. So the only commands that are going to change are that I need to change my file name here. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And I'm going to call it file name 2. And it's stored in the glass orb 2 directory. So I'm just going to add a 2 there, but the Blender file name is the same. So the other command that's going to change is the Blender rendering commands, the last commands that we use. So just a few of the options are changing here. So I'll just go through and explain it again. So everything here is the same. We're still running in the background. We're changing the file name to file name 2. So we make sure we select this second glass orb blend file. We still want to render with cycles. I want to output the image file. I've selected here /G drive my drive. So that's going to access my Google Drive account. I've told it I want to export it to the glass orb 2 directory, and I want to call the PNG file that it exports image1. The -F command here says I want to render just frame 1 as a PNG, and -F says I want to render it as a PNG file. And the last command is just the same. I want to render it using OPTIX. Just to show that this texture packaging method works, I'm just showing my Google Drive account here, so you can see Glass Orb 2, and all I have is the Blender file. There's no image textures in there. So let's go back to Google Colab now. And if you're still using the same instance of Colab that you used for the first part of this tutorial, then you don't need to install Blender again or download Blender. You don't need to connect to your Google Drive account again. All you need to do is run this new command here, which specifies file name 2path, so I'll click that. Then all you have to do is just run this last command here, which will render a single frame as a PNG file for us. So let's run that now. You can see it's found the Glass Orb 2 file, and it started rendering. Here we go, rendering frame 1. It's estimating about 2.5 minutes to render this at full HD with 500 samples. And you can see here it's rendering 135 tiles, and it's rendered tile 12 of 135. So I'll just give that a few more minutes to render, and then we'll come back and look at the final result. I'll upload a copy of this code as a text file, and I'll store the link in the description. You'll be able to download this code from my GitHub account. And there you have it. You can see that Blender has finished rendering. It has saved my PNG file to my Google Drive, to the Glass Orb 2 directory, and it's called image1001.png. And it says it's taken a total time of 2 minutes and 26 seconds, and it's quit Blender. Okay, so let's go to the Google Drive and just see what our output looks like. You might have to refresh your browser here, but you can see it's now created a new image file, which you can click on. And there you have it, a static frame from the Blender file, and it saved it as a PNG. And now you can just download this to your local PC. Just a few more points to consider. Google reports that the maximum runtime for a Google Colab session is 12 hours. And if your Google Colab session is idle for more than 90 minutes, it will terminate it. Google also states in their FAQ that they give priority to users who run the notebook open and interactively. So you can actually run Blender even if you close your browser once it's started rendering, but Google has or may cut you off. So it's not a perfect system. And you can't render for more than 12 hours at a time. So once you finish your Blender render, you want to go up here to Runtime, go to Manage Sessions, and you can see here I've got 2 Google Colab sessions running, and it's saying one of them is using the GPU, which is the one we just used. So you want to make sure you press Terminate, or terminate both of them. So this will make sure that you're not using the GPU behind the scenes, and next time you want to use Google Colab, you might not be given access to a GPU by Google. So terminating the sessions means you're not using the GPU with your browser closed, basically. So Google also says that they give priority to users who haven't used Google a GPU for a while. So if you are using if you are using a GPU on Google Colab an awful lot, then you might find later on that you might not have access to a GPU for a while, but you will be given access again eventually. You can actually just say you want to use the CPU. If you're not too pushed for time, you can go Notebook Settings and just say None. And when you render it, it will just use an available CPU, which will obviously take a lot longer, but it's a free CPU for you. Thank you very much for watching part 2 of this tutorial. If you enjoyed this tutorial or any of my other videos, please don't forget to subscribe. I'll be uploading new Blender tutorials regularly. Thanks for watching.